get started, I will let you know that we are recording this session and it will be posted on our website. So you can go back and revisit it if you want to look at the slides again or hear anything that was discussed. My name is Jason Euler. I'm the General Counsel and Secretary to the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, and thank you for being with us today. We are doing an informational webinar to address some compliance policy updates. There's two policies that we are revising. They are older policies. They are the policy and guidance statement for the settlement of civil penalties and enforcement actions. This policy was, it's a current policy we have. We're updating it. It was last updated in 2001. The second is our civil penalty matrix. And last time this policy was updated was in 1996. So just to give you a bit of context of why we're proceeding with revisions at this time. So you know what to expect today. We have about a 20-minute presentation for you where we'll review the objectives that we're trying to achieve in these revisions, and we'll also review the process and the public comment timeline for these policies. These policies are up and we are currently in the public comment period. We'll also provide a 10 to 15 minute period where you can submit questions via the comment function on WebEx. You can submit your questions at any time, but we will probably end up handling them at the end. And we'll be able to have folks here available to answer those questions, or if there's something we can't answer, we will get your information and get back to you. The two policies are meant to sort of work together, and that's one of the revisions we'll talk about was make sure they were consistent and work together. The policy and guidance statement of civil settlements of civil penalties and enforcement actions. We really go into a lot of explanation of our regulatory authority and our compliance mission. It's really meant to update, and document some of what we're really doing. It's not outside of maybe the addition of environmental justice issues, which is a newer concept. Most of this is stuff that we've been doing for the past several years, and we're codifying it. So nothing should be a surprise if you're a permit holder in that regard. Factors considered by compliance in assessing penalties and negotiating settlements. The Commission has a really good track record. I've been here 8 years, and we've been able to find a compliance settlement pathway. We've never had to actually go to court for settlements, and most of our regulated members work really well with us when we find an issue, and our focus is on really fixing a violation and making sure we put systems in place so it doesn't happen in the first place. And that's where we're happy to work with you and help you through that process. We also provide some expanded explanation of subjective criteria that are used in reaching our determinations. And these are the factors that are in our regulations. We provide a little more context to those in the effort of just providing, sort of much information as we can so folks know what to expect if there is an enforcement process that we have to go through with them. In the civil penalty matrix, we do an explanation of regulatory authority and the penalty amounts. The penalty is determined. Our amount is limited by the compact, which is the law, federal and state. All jurisdictions have passed that law that guide what we can do on the enforcement end, and it provides expanded definitions and as much clarity as we can for folks when they look at those policies together. These policies, actually, we started revising these as a part of a broader initiative. We had a rulemaking over the past 2 years, and we started looking at our compliance policies as part of that. Given COVID-19 and the need to sort of work on one thing at a time, we slowed down these revisions until after that rulemaking was complete. Our rulemaking was codified in fall of last year, so now it's time for us to go forward and propose these policies. We researched our member jurisdiction compliance policies. The commission is made up of the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, as well as the federal government represented by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And we want a particular emphasis of the trend in those policies toward greater transparency and also incorporation of environmental justice principles. We also reviewed several members' environmental justice policies as they are developed, and I'll say are developing. This is an area that has, in the past couple of years, that has gotten a lot more attention from regulatory agencies, and we are, looking at our members, and be wanting to be consistent with where their policies are going as well. And all this material was incorporated in these revisions. We were able to finalize them early this year to get them to this proposed state where they are out now for public comment. I will turn it over now to the Commission's Assistant Counsel, Kurt Sebastian, who has been working with our compliance staff to provide these revisions. So go ahead, Kurt.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jason. All right, folks, this slide just talks a little bit about our objectives. I'm going to pick up where Jason left off. And I'd like to give you sort of a broad overview of our objectives in revising the policies. And then the subsequent slides, we're going to dig a little bit into a little bit more detail on how we did those things. So we're going to review the policies in light of current penalty assessment and settlement practices and update for consistency. Jason touched on that. Right, over the course of 20 years, practices can adapt, change. That's a good thing. We wanted these revisions to reflect those changes and adaptations over that time period. Expand explanation of regulatory criteria and the Commission processes employed to negotiate the settlement agreements for greater transparency. And that's really part of an evolving trend in compliance departments to make the process more transparent, that is more relatable, especially to the public, especially to maybe folks that aren't involved in these kinds of actions as much, and to maybe start to formalize a little bit some of the criteria that have traditionally been more subjective. Jason mentioned we want to incorporate environmental justice principles. To that, we looked largely to the member jurisdictions. And we wanted to make sure that the policies included a lot of specific regulatory references so that the policies and practices are directly linked to the regulations. Update for consistency with current practices. So what does that mean in a bit more detail? There have been changes in the two and a half decades since these policies were last updated. On our part, regulatory additions and updates, policy additions and updates like this one, and Commission practices and procedures for addressing enforcement actions over that time have adapted, as I said, have changed. And that's a good thing. We want to make sure, again, that our new policies reflect that. And there's been, as always, sort of an evolution of the general regulatory landscape. So certainly we do look to the national level, other states, particularly our member jurisdictions, and we want to make sure that we keep apprised of the changes that are occurring there. We wanted to make sure that any changes we make are consistent with these general practices. And especially, we want to make sure that they reflect changes we've made to our practices and procedures over the years. We have a specific focus on explaining the subjective criteria. I mentioned that's an evolving trend. So this would be a movement toward formalizing some of the more subjective criteria that may make understanding the sort of what we would refer to in the legal world as the black letter of the regulations more understandable, right? The words in the regulations, we want to make them more relatable. That's an emerging compliance standard, as I mentioned, both on the state and national level. And one of the general focuses there is to make sure that compliance actions are and have become steadily more focused on education and assistance. So explanation of regulatory criteria and expanded references. So Jason touched on this. I touched on this in sort of a broader sense. But what we want to do is link these principles that we're writing down in both the settlement policy and the penalty grid directly to the Commission's regulations. The regulations, in turn, provide a concrete basis for the practices outlined in the policies. So we want a reciprocal relationship there. We want the policies to provide an expanded definition of how we apply and interpret those regulations, and the regulations are, again, the basis for the policies. They also provide a source of authority, right? And what we want to end up with, our ultimate goal here is to allow the public to become a sort of a more informed reader of Commission regulations and to have a better understanding of our practice. All right, so I mentioned, both Jason and I mentioned environmental justice principles. What we have at the top bullet there is a quote from Commission Resolution 2020-105. And I'll just sort of read through the highlights here. Our executive director is empowered to review all existing policies, procedures, and practices, so of the commission, utilized by the commission at all levels and in all programs, including compliance, to create, enhance, and improve its commitment to inclusion, diversity, and environmental justice. So the resolution says we'll look at everything that we're doing in terms of these principles. As a consequence, sort of in a concrete response to that, the public hearing and notice procedures have been adjusted for greater accessibility and awareness. Our member jurisdictions are all implementing environmental justice principles and developing significant environmental justice programs. So we want to look to those, look for guidance there. And we want to reflect commitment to EJ principles in both policies by considering impacts to EJ areas and communities and potentially factoring these elements into penalty assessments. All right, so the revision process. So those were sort of our outlines. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the process that we actually undertook. And I think we were able to achieve our goals. So our objectives were achieved. We wrote the new material. So that is, our revisions were designed to reflect the policy perspectives that I mentioned of the member jurisdictions. And we wanted to reinforce the idea and rewrite both policies with the idea of the sort of companion set in mind. So we wanted to make reading one facilitate an understanding of the other. If you're looking at the penalty grid, we wanted to cross-reference enough so that the settlement policy would help you understand it and vice versa. And I think that we achieved that. All right, so policy perspectives of the member jurisdictions. The policies of the member jurisdictions research, that was a large part of my responsibility, so I got to spend some time doing that. Those principles that we found, and we were looking for sort of, especially the overlapping principles, those were incorporated. Some instances where we thought there was great language or a good practice, we borrowed those directly. And all four were incorporated to update the commission's position. Regulatory references. A significant number of regulatory references were added to the settlement policy to provide clarity and a source of authority. So I mentioned those were our goals. I think that we achieved that. Each factor considered in an enforcement action was linked directly to a specific regulation. So you'll see that's actually a specific section of the settlement policy. Factors considered, they were linked directly to a specific reg. And regulatory references were added to the penalty matrix to clarify source of authority and the interaction, as I mentioned, with the settlement policy. So that comes back to that principle of sort of the companion nature of these two policies. This is a sample from the settlement policy, paragraph 1, and just wanted to talk about, this is sort of to display the elements that I've just mentioned and how we incorporated them, right? So we see the sort of the primary content is bolded there at the beginning of the paragraph. This one talks about serious environmental harm. You'll see there a reference to the penalty matrix. So that's the companion nature. And you'll see at the end, the regulatory section of 18 CFR. So Code of Federal Regulations is referenced. Environmental justice. Environmental justice initiatives of member jurisdictions were researched. Policy principles, and in some cases, specific languages and practices incorporated. So there, again, I was able to do a lot of that research, and I think we did exactly what we wanted. We looked at what our member jurisdictions were doing, and we were able to reflect those policies in our policies. Settlement policy, this is a sample dealing with specifically with some of the sort of the specific ideas that we incorporated with respect to environmental justice. So you'll see there, negative impacts to human health and the environment with a heightened focus on environmental justice areas. Then you'll see their impacts on environmental justice communities, and any impact in environmental justice areas will also be reviewed as relevant factors in assessing the severity of a given violation with respect to human health and safety. Right? So again, that's how we managed to incorporate the environmental justice principles. Expanded definitions and cross-referencing. We added So a complete set of definitions, an expanded set of definitions for minor, moderate, and severe, which are the levels of violation. Those are in the penalty matrix. As I mentioned, I think we were quite successful with cross-referencing and the sort of reciprocity between both policies and designing them as a companion set. And then I think our overall result, and this was certainly our goal, was a set of documents that reference each other in a very functional manner. And they also work well in conjunction with commission regulations to facilitate greater understanding and clarity, and to provide a sort of a more transparent look at what we're doing in compliance actions. Jason, I'll turn it back over to you at this point to talk about the public comment and adoption timeline.
Sure. So as I said at the beginning, these policies are currently out for public comment. If you, if you registered for this webinar, they had a link on that registration page. If you need to get to them, if you just go to our website on the front page under what's new, there'll be a headline that says, talking about the policies out for comment, and then below it there'll be links, and there's one where you can click directly on the link that says public comment. It will take you to where there are PDFs of the policies that you can download and print to read over, and then and also a submittable form where you can provide comments. So we released this on July 8th, for in the Federal Register and following in the our state administrative bulletins. Public comment period is open until the written public comment period is open until August 22nd. We have this webinar today just sort of to introduce the policies and sort of the, what we've highlighted is the reason and objectives behind them, and some of the changes that we made, the most significant of which would be adding the environmental justice concepts. It's also subject to a public hearing that is on August 11th. So if you don't want to send in a written comment, we can take oral testimony at the public hearing on the 11th, but you can also send in written comments, and they are, the transcript of the public hearing is shared with our commissioners, and all written comments are shared with our commissioners. Our tentative date for final adoption, depending on sort of the level of comment we get and the need to do a comment response, we would look for final adoption either at the September or December 2022 business meeting. We do have the chat open. If you had any sort of questions at this time, if not, I would invite you to read through the companion policies. And if you do have questions, Kurt's going to be our point person for that, and we provided his contact information on the screen there. So jot that down, and you are free to send him an email or give him a call once you delve into these policies and read them a bit further. If there are questions that come up, Kurt be happy to talk with you. And if he doesn't have the answer, he'll get the staff person who does. So I'll check. No comments have come through the chat. So we want to thank everybody for your interest and your attention. I won't hold you on any longer. Like I said, you will have plenty of chance, like I said, to look at the policies and ping us with questions. But remember, if you're calendaring it and you want to make comments, we encourage comments. We would love to hear back from you, especially if everything's clear, readability, understanding. We would be happy to take those comments, and they just got to be in by August 22nd. So thank you, everyone. I'll take one last check. All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Folks.